So should we open it up or?
Let's open it up.
Questions, comments,
Any comment I would make on that is like, I think,
set aside.
obvious already.
Yeah. Yeah, just thanks a lot because this actually helps us understand our own input. Confronted with
They were just saying we're passing the mic.
When you're confronted with an alternative way of thinking, it helps us understand our own approach. There are just two aspects that I want you to reflect on. But these are two important points you made, and you posited them as contradictory to what we are thinking, but it seems to me that they are in a way consistent. The first is, what is a good rule? And you explained, a good rule. I remember Shukumachat with his book which said that a good plan is one which is implemented. Otherwise, it's not a good plan. So it's true that in a very specific sense, a good rule is one which actually delivers. And it is very situation specific, country specific, norm specific, and each country probably has to work through its own norms, etc., to define its good rules. But what do we do in the immediate short term? Most countries just adopt what they think are good rules in other countries, and it's true that we actually ignore the fact that they have been developed in very different historical perspectives. So the point is actually moving from others' good rules to your own good rule. But here the analysis is probably of more short term, and whether the problems of accepting others' good rules actually not allow you to move towards your own good rules. So that's a bigger problem. So I think it's in a way consistent with what you say. The other thing is, you say that the Indian bourgeoisie has now attained a level of development where the long term matters. It's true that when you think of deals, there are countries which need very basic deals, which are not the kind of deals which an Indian firm might need. But even in Indian firms, production is dependent on a lot of short-term things that it gets from the government. So, for example, a contract while the government may not be able to deliver anything in the longer run, it can create problems in the shorter run. The firms always have to be mindful. And so a deal is not necessarily always getting something good, it is avoiding something bad as well. And so it seems to me that countries have to be mindful of both the rules and the deals, or the firms in these countries have to be mindful of both the rules and the deals. So I'd like your comments on these things. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Both of you have spoken about the deals and the policies like this. But the individuals who do the business, they have their own rules, and they know how to pick up the rules and get along. And they want to ease into business. They don't want to get into the raffles of most of the relativism which I'd like you to have. So my question is that both of you have explained the Indian perspective and the global perspective. And what is the fiction is a fact. Whatever the fiction you have described is the factual of the fact. And whatever he has said about the Indian economy is also very correct. But the main problem of Indian economy is the growing inequality. The growing inequality is a problem not in India but all the world. So is there anything for which we have come here to discuss? Can you throw some light on it?
Thanks, that was a very insightful talk. So I'm on, again, going back to the fundamentals that you also pointed out about what is a good law. I think somewhere there is an assumption that a good law is one that achieves high growth. But is that true? Because, I mean, when we speak about the say, all laws in India, at least I'm talking about India, okay, and pardon my ignorance about the rest of the world, so let's talk about India. A good law has to be consistent with the constitution, otherwise it will be invalid. Now the constitution never asks you to achieve growth, I mean high growth. In fact, for high growth you need maybe predictability, you need peace, you need lack of disorder, and therefore a lot of things like, for example, protecting minority rights may not be consistent with high growth in that sense. So, or maybe having a property rights in the fundamental rights would be necessary for a high growth, but our constitution was amended to remove the property rights out of fundamental rights into a general constitutional right. So a lot of constitution is not geared towards achieving high growth at all. So therefore, is it true to say that a good law must be a law that achieves high growth? And if that is the case, then I mean, the assumption that you are making is that a good law is always
I never
supposed to
said
be.
anything like that.
Okay, because I was trying to, no, I mean, that, the impression seems to be that a good law is supposed to achieve high growth.
No, I never said that.
Okay, so a good law is, need not achieve high growth. In that sense, I think, then my, kind of query is resolved, because my impression was that a good law tends, I mean, according to the assumption is that it will try to achieve high growth.
No, absolutely not.
That's all.
Yeah. I'll explain what I meant.
You want to respond quickly and again?
So let me respond. So first of all, we were moving across topics, and so maybe that led to some confusion. And clearly I've created confusion, and I probably should have put beautiful in quotes or something. What I meant is a law that was overambitious relative to the actual capability to implement it because it lacked the invisible infrastructure might look beautiful, but whatever its purpose, whether it's environmental regulation or protecting the rights of minorities or protecting, whatever, if in fact it creates discretionary power and coercive power of the implementers beyond the ability of the existing invisible infrastructure to restrict it, it's not going to achieve its purpose, right? Because it's not going to get implemented as designed. And this holds whatever your purpose is. So this wasn't beautiful laws are meant to induce growth. This is a more generic point about state capability, which is attempting to do too much too soon is like throwing your army into a battle before they're ready, and then undermines, in fact, a positive dynamic of developing. And this is true, again, whatever the public purpose is. And I think a lot of this, a lot of what Ajay was saying, is we need to be carefuler with our precision and terminology. I was sort of saying beautiful law as a kind of slightly snarky in quotes, which is you adopt a law, that might have worked elsewhere, where it relied on a whole set of invisible infrastructure, and when you move the beautiful law away from its natural environment, it can become very destructive. So that's the main point. Now, I am the world's last apparent, as far as I can tell, person that's concerned about inequality. Like, what I'm concerned about is inequity. So I know Larry and Sergey, guys that invented Google. I've met them. Don't know them well, but I've met them. I don't care what they're worth. Like, why do I care if they're worth $50 billion, $45 billion, $26 billion? Doesn't matter to me. They did what they did. They ran a race. They've invented a product that every one of us uses every day for free. Like, I have no problem with inequality. What I'm worried about is in a closed order deals economy, billionaires are being created by having preferential deals. That's inequity. And it's the inequity that results in the high wealth that then creates, describing, so I'm not concerned about Larry and Sergey. I am concerned about some people with last names in India I won't use. Because the source of their billions isn't that they ran a fair race, built a better product, and won in the market. The source of their wealth is they ran an unfair race, are manipulating the aspects of public power to create billions of dollars. But that doesn't worry me because they're billionaires. It worries me because that process was unfair and unjust. So I'm worried about inequity in the world. And part of my point is, in a deals world, there's vast, vast scope for inequity to be combined with inequality. And that is what I meant by self-delegitimating. Because a system that generates outsized returns to your ability to manipulate the system delegitimizes itself. Whereas a system that produces, I just don't see any reason why I should be concerned with how much money Mark Zuckerberg's worth.
Then your products will not be sold by the ordinary people.
I don't-
And you get to back to the.
But again, that's kind of a concern, but I think a vastly larger concern is the inequity concern. And I think in the current political and other discourse globally, those are being conflated. They're assuming that every billionaire is making billions unjustly, as opposed to and the routine inequality, I kind of is concerned, but it's not in my mind the major concern of the world, in part because it depends on whether you know. So I'm worried, I'm really, really worried about inequity. I'm just not that worried about inequality, I think. Do you want to address any of this?
I agree.
Okay, another round. Where's the microphone?
I can just speak up, yeah. So, again, because I'm obsessed with the Indian public sector and its decline over the last 15, 20 years, in some sense, is it a good thing that for a lot of firms, your main client is not the state anymore? Right? It's not the state, right? So 30 years ago, for everyone, your main client was the state in some senses, except for kind of consumer goods and those kinds of things. Sometimes a lot of that has changed, some of it has not. Does that make rules more enforceable? Does that make the deals world less of a problem? Or am I delusional, right? It's kind of the state's main ultimate consumer of everything. And I'm sure Ajay has some choice words on this too. So.
Okay. I can actually, my voice is pretty loud.
No, wait, they're recording.
Right. Thank you. So I'm from Indonesia, and we're just as messed up as India, if not more so. So there are two things here. This whole idea of premature load-bearing and state capability, I'm starting to really buy into that slowly. But my question is, if introducing a beautiful law, and I'm using air quotes here, if introducing a beautiful law collapses further, the implementation, then what would a good transition look like? Do we have incremental improvement in the law, and for every improvement, we expect the state capability to be pushed towards that increment, or do we stick with the current law and just in some way increase the state capability to get closer to really implementing the current law, and after that we make a jump to the beautiful law? Or, what would be a good transition be? And my second question is, this whole idea of elite interest. I think in the current context, especially in Indonesia, and I think in India as well, we also need to consider the populist interest, because right now, in both democracies, the populace has a lot of interest, and it's very easy to ride the populist wave. If any movement from a closed-door, disordered deals towards a rule of law requires some kind of a downward trajectory in growth, for instance, that would definitely be against the interests of the populace, and in democracy that would be almost improbable for any administration to opt for that. And therefore, if you introduce that context, what can a benevolent democratic elected administration to.
So we take two. Oh, the mic is coming.
Or I can speak otherwise.
But we keep it short.
Thank you, sir. To start with, I would say I'm a layman amongst the technocrats. And I happen to be a student and comparative studies in the evolution of history, into the evolution of history of law. But what I have to observe, it's my observation, when I listen law, it sickens me. Because my personal experience throughout my life, whenever I have come across the law, I think law has been cheated by the evidence. What I mean to say is, game called evidence. Before you talk about the law, you should talk about the game called evidence. And that's where law fails. So law without evidence has no meaning at all. Because in my life it has been so. It happened throughout the ages. There is a law and there is evidence. And the law fails. That's number one. Number two. Now coming to the economy. State of economy in India and the world. Declining profit margins except high-tech products or monopoly products. Except those products, the marginal profit is declining everywhere, at the very local level as well as the international level, because there is a competition, right? But this is as a result of that, the whole market, even in India and everywhere, it has become a seller's market. There is no buyer. The buyers are very, very few. So how now to sum up, because I will take all of your time. To sum up, I would say, how to turn Indian market, we can't, but this is all we can do, to turn Indian market, buyer's market. There's no buyer, there's no purchasing power. Who is responsible? Thank you.
I see is one can agree with both Lant and Ajay, although I'm less optimistic than Ajay is about the maturity of the Indian bourgeoisie. You have given an economist construction of what the bourgeoisie is like. But then, just to focus a little bit on the one part of the story which you mentioned and kind of then put aside, which is the whole export sector story, right? So one of the contrasts you made is, look, East Asia, in a sense, leveraged its deal-making phase to get export-oriented industries going, credibles going, right? And you're in a really bad shape if you don't leverage your deal-making space for doing actually just that, right? So if you're just stuck in housing and infrastructure, you're right done for. So the question, in some senses, right, is, if you look back over India over the last 20 years, and somebody asked the question, why doesn't India become a more competitive export economy, right? So part of the answer is, okay, people are not investing. That's one answer, which is kind of bad laws, right? Then there's this whole other answer, which is one, the basics of how you actually get to be competitive, right? Low cost energy, low cost infrastructure, human capital, all the standard exchange rate possibly under some circumstances, all the building blocks of an export economy, right, are the ones that never crossed any policymakers and was not even high on our economic agenda, right? And so the relevant counterfactor is not so much the deals versus rules. The relevant counterfactor is simply we just have no idea and did not pay attention to what it gets to make an export competitive economy. So if you want to speak to that side of the...
There's one last question, and then we can.
Well, now I have to write it down.
Sorry.
I can't really remember 5 questions.
Okay, I have just a comment, which is, in India, trade-off is not between beautiful laws and the rule of law. For decades, we undermined rule of law, and every time we face a problem because of that, we go for a new law, without intending to implement it. But my one small question is, are there any examples outside OECD where a country moved from deals capitalism to rules capitalism?
one simple comment just to respond to you. So once again, when I think of a beautiful law, I think of implementation constraints. We have to take implementation constraints seriously. Sometimes it means that we've just got to back away and say, we don't know how to do this. Okay? So then just do not do certain kinds of state intervention and state coercion when we do not have the ability to implement it correctly. Sometimes it means recognize and deeply understand all the missing pieces of the invisible infrastructure and encode them into the law that you're drafting. Okay? So for example, when we have worked on drafting securities law, we have had to build in hundreds of sections to deal with the gaps in the Indian legal institutional arrangements. And only then you get a complete law where you have a fully articulated theory of change that, okay, if all this goes into fray, there will be these checks and balances and there will be this incentive compatibility for a self-interested person in the government system to do the work correctly. Short of this, your law is headed for failure. And in my mind, this is the cutting edge of how to do Indian public policy right. Yeah. And it is not economics. It is entirely in public administration, in understanding of the sociology of bureaucracy. It's in public choice theory. It's in law. And so whether you think about fertilizer policy and then you think about the entire implementation machinery surrounding which you have a hope in hell of that policy working. So we economists have tended to be at 40,000 feet thinking about what's a good law, what's a good policy.
What's the mapping?
Yeah, so that's nice, but what is missing in India is that entire infrastructure of who is the inspector, how does a raid take place, how is evidence presented, how does a hearing take place, why do you have any hope in hell that this will work properly?
In particular, given the premature, your point, meaning if I have endowed a tax collector or securities inspector with both executive, judiciary, and bureaucratic functions, there's no way in hell that won't get abused. Yeah. Like there's just no way in hell that that's not premature load bearing. And the difficulty thing is that if that stays non-politicized, it's really, really irritating. But if it then gets politicized, meaning the political structure recognizes the opportunity of the essentially infinitely discretionary coercion ability of the existing laws, then you're really headed, and I'm not saying factually this is the case, but you're really headed into a very dangerous situation, because as long as the bureaucracy asking kind of more or less autonomously for kind of self-interested or ideological reasons, but if one begins to use that infinite discretion for partisan political purposes, that's embedded there and unchecked there, then you're headed into a whole new kettle of fish. So for Tob's question, I think my colleague Ricardo Hausman is like I'm the world's last unreconstructed inequality person, but he continues to believe that firms should have more say over what governments do. And every time he says that, people are like, are you nuts? But I think the response to that is what he means is you need to get politicians worried about what would be the set of public inputs into successful competitive industries, and hence you actually need the state to be responsive to the firms about what do you need to be a successful magician. The danger is and the danger is when people say the state should be more influential, they see it all going into power broker, and rightly so. And so I think you're exactly on the right issue is we haven't somehow gotten Indian discourse and Indian policymaking around the question of how do we proactively support the creation of the magicians. And again, that was in one way or another a key to the success of East Asia is they had positive feedback loops from firms. There's a book called Embedded Autonomy, right? But the problem is separating embedded autonomy from its close cousin in bed with the money. Which I've never heard anyone draw the connection between those two titles, but embedded autonomy looks a lot like in bed with the money, and when you're in bed with the money, you can easily get down to why would I bother with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world I can't impose costs on, whereas the non-tradable sector I can impose the cost. So I think you're exactly right, and it requires, but not just a kind of neutral state. It actually requires the state to provide critical inputs, because again, Ricardo Hausmann's theory of productivity is it actually requires longer and more complex change of inputs that need to be present to be successful. And a lot of the successes that Ajay points to basically conclude themselves from needing inputs for the state. Like, we set up this campus in Bangalore, where we provide our own water, we provide our own power, we provide our own satellites, we kind of, whereas to be successful in a broader array of competitive export industries, you need to have more and more kind of publicly provided inputs, which means you need to be responsive to the state in a way that doesn't, you know, lead to that, how one does that. The question about state capability, I think, you know, and these aren't labeled right, and I have another, is it basically, and this is PDIA, and I don't know how much PDIA was, you graduated when? 20, yeah, anyway. So, but basically, if one thinks about it, it's, do we push ahead in practices in small incremental steps and try and consolidate that into law, or do we think the law is the instrument of change? And, you know, what Shyam was just saying is, often we assume that if the law is not working, let's pass a new law, because ultimately the law is the instrument of change. Whereas I, by and large, see law as the consolidation of successful practices rather than the initiation, but you need to get those practices embedded into the law ultimately. And so I think
So Lant, when
there's a lot of ways, though, you can push ahead on practices within the overall legal rubric and hope you then, the dynamics go this way. Whereas these huge leap dynamics, like the right to education, I can declare there's a right to something that the state has no ability to produce. Like, I can maybe get some political gains by declaring that, by the way, I have created a right to X, but I haven't created the capability for X. Whether that has positive or negative dynamics on the capability, the over-promising actually leads to environments in which it doesn't build capability. So I think the short answer is build capability. The second thing about being a democracy, just saying, the second thing about being a democracy is you know, I have no good answer. So let me stop. The question about whether the pushing the private sector to be more your clients, I think is a good question. I haven't really thought it through, but I think from Ajay's point of view, I think ultimately that's what's going to lead to rule of law. Because the difficulty is when the government was both your regulator and your major client, they had, you know, in the end, the government can renege, and if they renege in a legal way, they've reneged, and so the risks to being a private sector investor, and when the dominant regulator, law provider, and producer, I think I'm maybe in between Pratap and Ajay's optimism about what the bourgeois in India want. I do think the capitalization point's a huge point, which is a huge part of a deal, the limitations of a deal's economy is I can't sell it. I can't put it on them. You know, if I'm profitable because I have cut a corrupt deal with a given politician, I can get rich in the short run, but I can't capitalize that beyond the period in which people have the credibility of the capital, and that creates, I think, huge problems for innovation, and the innovation's becoming routinized. People seeing that the path of probability is routinizing productivity improvements.
So it's simpler, the self-interest of people to become billionaires.
Yeah, but on the other hand, Ajay, I don't want to push back too hard, but there are lots of billionaires in the world that have been created on the backs of deals.
Yeah, but
maybe not in India.
No, they are.
But certainly in other places.
I'm saying that when you move from a rules to deals environment, the NPV is calculated over longer time horizons.
Absolutely.
And then people care that what I have is not a one-off business model, but there is some stability surrounding it.
Yeah.
But it's the top 30 that care, and the top 30
the top
get
30 will
it.
get
Which is
anyway.
exactly what has happened.
Exactly.
It depends on who we mean by. Wow.
Yeah. So I want to say
And by
two
the way,
things.
There's one thing though, is that because one thing, here's a thing I learned from Argentina. And since I learned it from Argentina, no one in the room can have any strong opinion about it.
We are Indians, we have strong opinions regardless, but go on.
Which is one of the ways in which the military came to power in Argentina is that between the economy and the military was seen as the hopeful path of meritocracy.
Yes.
The economy was seen as dominated by firms for which the typical not well-born person had no chance of becoming the leader of those firms because it was seen as a hereditary gulf that I couldn't cross. Whereas in the military, if I was a good military officer, I could become a general. And so the economist's point of view is that the free market economy legitimizes itself through becoming a mechanism of opportunity. And it took me decades of living and working around Argentina before I realized, holy shit, the typical Argentine sees the military as the nexus of meritocratic opportunity and the private sector as being hereditary privilege, and hence what was legitimate to run the country was the military. What was illegitimate to do was to reward the private sector, right? I think that's a big issue.
I think it's a little bit mirrors India. Just a little.
You notice I didn't say that. I learned that from Argentina.
I want to add one line of thought to this discussion. Everything that we are saying flows into, now I want to continue where you were. Think about the problem about a government that is contracting out to a private person. Okay, so this is the oldest idea in service delivery, that can you arrive at contracts with some private persons and get some things done? Because it's very difficult to solve principal agent problems inside my civil service. So if I have employees, it's hard to get them to do work. Can I contract it out? I feel that with the decline in state capability in India from the mid-90s till today, we've actually gone backwards on our ability to contract out. Because contracting out is also very, very hard. Today, the government is seen as the worst counterparty for contracting by private people. The government can randomly renege on payments. The government can disrupt a contract. So many firms don't like to do business with the government, who would have otherwise been willing to consider being part of government procurement 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Today, they just don't do business with the government. There's a certain kind of firm that knows how to handle government, who will bid for those contracts.
Okay.
Last word.
You get to run over time because it's your room, I guess. There's some hereditary.
Senior age. The characterization that there has been an objective decline in state capabilities. What is the basis for that claim? I mean, if you looked at outright contracts, if your story was true, we would not have built excess capacity power plants. Clearly, we did manage to get something built. We would not have managed to get the airports built. We built more roads in the last 10 years than we had in the previous 40 together, right? So, the general statement that there has been a decline in state capacity, I mean, it's even more dubious than the GDP data.
Okay, there was one hand that we have to give quickly before the last word back.
So how you talked about there being how you spoke about there being a transition from a deals-based regime to a rules-based capitalism regime. So from my limited interaction with the law and the bureaucracy, there is often a tendency to legitimize those deeds processes in the rules. So the form that the rules may take may end up legitimizing and incentivizing those very players which were previously indulging in, deals capitalism. So I would like to know your views and sort of how do we mediate through that regime?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd be famous. And this gets back to Shyam's question. We actually don't have, the puzzle with the whole literature about institutions and their dynamics is that we don't have, in fact, a ton of transitions from deals economies to rules economies. We have a set of historical legacy rules economies that got more and more rules economies, a set of economies that have bounced back and forth in terms of performance on various dimensions within being deals economies. But if you look at standard indicators and the standard indicators of whether or not one is a kind of strong state or at least as dubious as GDP, but they're there, we just haven't had that many, you know, if you look at the number of countries, so if I take Portugal as the lowest limit of being a rules place, right, of a capability state, we really only have like 2 countries that have ever passed that threshold. So we don't have a strong dynamics of becoming rules economies, and since we don't have a strong dynamics of it, empirical people like me that say how we learn about stuff is by observing when stuff happens, we have a lot of variation in growth performance around and within deals and transitions among deals. We have very few, basically Korea and Chile are the only 2 countries that have definitively passed the threshold of becoming rules economies, and one of them seems really unhappy of it and wants to go back to something else. So we don't have a ton of good examples. Since we don't have a ton of good examples, what you want as an empirical person is lots of variation and interesting examples, and we just don't have enough to make any, I mean, this is a view on which nearly every economist expresses an opinion, and almost no economist has any good data.
Thank you. When we conceptualized this, we knew it would be provocative and fun, and both of you lived up to that. So thank you very much.